AMD reported a good quarter. They beat and they raised guidance. And so, of course, the stock was off.
Of course.
You can't take gross margin percentage to the bank. They only accept gross margin dollars.
But if those models don't keep getting updated, it's kind of like, well, then what's the point? My default is, the cloud's just always going to be better. It starts to kind of work with you, get to the point to where I'm going to go execute a complex task, and it's going to be what you want when I'm done with it. OpenAI is also a sun, and everybody wants to attach themselves to OpenAI. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greetings, programs. I'm Jay Goldberg.
Well, we had a fun week, of earnings and news, and we're going to dig into some of that today. It's interesting. Probably one of the main hits for this week was AMD. I think we talked about this a little bit, right? Kind of last earnings time, or I guess after their Advancing AI Summit, that it didn't really seem like anybody was going to up their numbers for Instinct this year. I don't think there was an expectation that Lisa Su and management was going to come in and say, oh, we're going to do a lot better. They're still saying double digit over last year, which consensus is tracking to a $7 to $8 billion number. That seems relatively intact, with the exception of some China, which we can talk about. But again, I don't see that number, their number, really changing in terms of year over year, double digit growth. But really, there was a couple of interesting nuances. I humorously, I don't know if you saw this, but not to open this can of worms again, but I saw the crew, the usual suspects that were in the NVIDIA was fraud camp back in the day, now turning their eyes to AMD because of this GPU write down, and they're like, it's just all inflated. And I'm like, oh no, how is this happening again? But let's go through the nuances of this. So I'll let you jump off on the take of overall AMD.
So, AMD reported a good quarter. They beat and they raised guidance. And so, of course, the stock was off.
Of
I,
course.
I think I think what was really going on is there's a little bit of people people asked a lot of questions about China, right? Because they went through the same thing that Nvidia did, where they were restricted from shipping the China variant of the MI 300, 325, whatever. But they were restricted, and now they're not restricted, but they need to apply for a waiver, and whatever. It's going to take a few months. Uh, there's some lingering concerns about gross margin because Instinct products are below corporate average on margin. And I think that's partly because they're still new and they're not fully yielded, but also because AMD is competing on price to win share, which is the sensible
Right.
thing to do. The CFO Jean made a comment. She quoted like my favorite financial metric in the semiconductor universe. Is you can't take. She didn't say it this way, but what I usually say is you can't take gross margin percentage to the bank. They only accept gross margin dollars, right? And so if you have to take a few hits on gross margin percentage points, that's fine if you're bringing in more absolute dollars. I think you're right. Is 2 months ago, 3 months ago, they had their AI event, and it was clear then that they had real traction, they had real customer interest, enough to give them credibility in the space. They're not going to take 20 points of share from Nvidia anytime soon, but they don't need to. They just keep plugging away. They have a solid beachhead now in AI, and I think they can continue to expand on that.
Yeah, but so all right. So there's two parts to this. I mean, the stock went down. It's largely recovered. I think people kind of saw the light, which was fine. I think like we had been talking about, that I think they've made it clear, right? They're not just a CPU company. They should be well positioned. I do hear a lot of chatter from those in data center, those in the neo clouds, that their products have definitely gotten much more competitive. ROCm has gotten better, so I think they've addressed a number of the concerns, which I make the point to say they're going to compete for dollars. How big of dollars, right? You gotta make this up, right? I think the overall accelerator TAM, out into Lisa's time frame, 28, 29, 30, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. It's anywhere from 250 to 350 from what I've seen of most people's forecasts. You have to imagine that while GPUs are probably still 70, 80% of that, which I think is consensus and a fair analysis, they're going to get some of it. How much? I don't know, right? She came out and said tens of billions of dollars. And I really was quite entertained, actually, that I would say 80% of the analysts' questions was just trying to ask the same question a different way. How much money do you think you can make here? Like, what's your real dollar value? And she wouldn't give it away. They didn't give it away, but everybody was trying to get them to be like, do you think it could be tens of billions by 2028? Because whatnot. Because that's really the upside dollar TAM growth, because I think CPUs are CPUs, right? And she did make a point that we made, I want to say their last episode or the episode before, about general purpose CPUs in AI native or cloud native CPUs need to be upgraded because agents cause those things to slow down. And it's true. We see it. We see it in our workloads when we ask our agent to go use one of the software programs that we're using, in a browser. It's slow. It crashes. It doesn't work. It creates errors. So all infrastructure needs to be upgraded. So I think when she made this point, I think her words were along the lines of, just remember, all that capex, right, that's being spent is not all going to GPUs. Like, a lot of that cap, not a lot, but a portion of that capex is also going to CPUs. So agreed. We all agreed, right? The CPU business is great, but everybody sees a much bigger dollar sign, right, for the AI accelerator side. And I think that's primarily where, that interest keeps coming back to. And I think, again, right, if you just look at the timing of this, and we're going to talk about AI networking, in a little bit, the timing of this is that they'll actually be pretty on time, right? Just one generation behind Blackwell with their Helios next year for scale out rack clusters. And really, like, that's everybody's talking about, as we build out our compute and we try to deal with the inference demand. OpenAI talked about this, yesterday. They're building the compute clusters. Those compute clusters are at neo clouds, they're at Oracle, they're at Azure, they're at wherever, but they want those clusters. Wherever those clusters exist is where you will be routed for your inference workload. So AMD is not there now, right? These are Grace Blackwell systems I'm talking about that are clusterable systems. But they'll be there next year. So they'll be very well positioned for this massive ramp. They're not going to be that far behind. And so I think that bodes well. But I think, again, it just comes back to, we agree they'll compete for dollars, but now you got to figure out how much dollars, and then how much does that thesis cause you to change your multiple, right, or your valuation of AMD. And that's, I think, people haven't done that yet, but that's the question, right? How many dollars? How big of dollars?
Yeah, so I'll avoid the valuation question, but my rule of thumb, though, is, the first generation of any brand new thing is not going to be production ready.
Yeah. What was the take on, I mean, I do feel like they didn't, I mean, I guess data center's been down 2 quarters in a row, which was kind of a bigger concern. Um, Hit some of the, call it, more negative takes. Like, what were some of the draws that caused, I would say, just a little bit of the initial panic, and how much of it was warranted or fair versus just a short-term blip, um, versus a long-term right play?
So I think the data center their data center revenue were down, but they attributed that to China, which, that math works out. Now I will note that Nvidia did not have that problem. Nvidia couldn't ship to China, and they still met numbers for data center. Um, so that was, I think that was one take. This gross margin problem I mentioned before, they're competing on price, which makes sense. I think there's still a lot of skepticism about just how big they can be in data center, how competitive they are with uh, with Nvidia. ROCm, like they said this. I think Lisa said this on the call. Like ROCm has gotten much better, but it still has a long way to go.
Yeah.
So their
Right.
software competing with CUDA is still, you know, pretty far behind. But it's they're adapting and catching up. I think when you talk to the more technical, deep in the weeds type investors, there is still a fair degree of skepticism about what they can do against Nvidia.
Yeah.
Uh, and and there's still some old timers, like people who've been around forever, who still just don't quite trust that AMD can
Right.
execute. I
Right.
love talking to those guys because
Right.
they're
It's the PTSD. I know. They've burned us before. Blah blah
15
blah.
years ago
I
they
get
were
it.
incompetent,
I get it.
and it's coming back. So I think those are the concerns I heard. Right?
Do you think there's any this I think is actually a really interesting debate, and we're trying to figure out some of this technically on our end. Back to um, the GPU kind of driving more a new CPU cycle, and if you look at what went on in general purpose servers, it was roughly I think two two to four CPUs to one GPU, depending on a mix. That's shifting in upscales to like four GPUs to two CPUs in AI servers. Um, but I do wonder if there's merit to the idea that the CPU TAM can grow for general purpose servers. We talked a little bit about this, but I think what you're seeing, and I think what we didn't fully understand with this agentic workflows, is actually how much the CPU is stressed. And so I just wonder if that means, to some degree, we'll see maybe rack innovation, we'll see different networking innovation within kind of the cloud native software in order to keep up, right, with the agentic stuff, and that might change some of our initial thinking on just the size of traditional, compute data centers.
I mean, you and I have talked about this multiple times in the past. I don't think there's a clear answer yet. I don't think people are totally clear. It definitely, given some of the advances like Chat GPT-5 or GPT-5, which we'll get to, it doesn't feel like it's going that way. It feels like it's still very very GPU heavy, and the CPU to GPU ratio in these clusters is whatever the number is, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, whatever it averages out to. It, like that's good for CPUs, but like you just look at the raw numbers and CPUs just aren't. I don't think they're growing this year.
No, I don't. No, I agree. I don't think they're growing this year. And to be honest with you, I don't know. I think we wouldn't see signs of this to next year. I just wonder if that infrastructure, needs to get rethought, because I will say, and we'll get to this GPT stuff in a minute. I really do think people are now really rethinking what the future of software looks like when something that's less static and far more dynamic in terms of its ability to engage and interact, and the way that agents work, not just within existing software paradigms too, your CRM stuff, your software stuff. And I just wonder. Again, I agree with you. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out there as a possible thing to watch. Could the shape of general cloud native, right, software CPU infrastructure change to the positive, and again, more complex builds, more complex infrastructure, higher ASPs, to keep up with what we're seeing in GPUs? Because I will note, right, it's very slow. You're seeing the slowness of inference with these thinking systems, um, and that's not all because of the GPU. So anyway, I'm just lobbing that out there as something to watch. A thesis we will keep exploring and talking about. I am sure. Okay, AI networking. I really enjoyed what happened this week, to be honest with you, because I feel like all of a sudden the how do I say this, the casual semiconductor investors, or maybe even those that were just very heavily or trendy to follow compute are now like, hey, what's going on with these networking companies that have like AI backbones that either do connectivity or solutions for switches, because they're crushing their earnings. They're having a massive, and Astera Labs is probably one of my favorite because I went into my research database just to see how much coverage they had, and a fair number of banks don't cover Astera Labs, and I imagine that right now they are all like, we need to initiate coverage and get a due diligence on this company, because of they're very well positioned, as was Arista. I think you're going to see very similar comments from Cisco, being built out on their networking demand. And it's just interesting because I know, and we've talked about this. Networking's cool. Jay loves networking, always more than me. He's a networking fan. But now, like the AI fabric stuff, and this goes back to what I was saying. These things need to be networked in clusters so that 100,000, 200,000 GPUs, someday a million TPUs, GPUs need to function as one compute set. No latency, essential speed. That's how we're going to handle the inference build out. And that east to west networking is absolutely critical. And that's what's changing these connectivity platforms that either license IP to the hyperscalers who are building this or doing this themselves, building complicated chiplets. In fact, OCP in Taiwan, I mean, Astera Labs was there, A Lab was there, Cisco was there, AMD was there, and I'm just reading some summaries of that. I think OCP in fall here in the Bay Area, I think people are just going to come out the woodworks now to really start to get their handle on what's happening in AI networking, because it's like everybody woke up to what's happening in networking and the increase in ASP, in complexity, in design, for those companies that provide parts of that backbone. Broadcom will benefit from this too. Are There's just a huge spotlight on this now. Like, so many conversations on networking happened this year, and really, again, I'm saying AI networking fabrics for clusters of compute inference as the key. So I just found that fascinating. It's not something that is new to us. We've talked about this a lot, but it's like the world woke up this
Wait,
week
wait, wait, wait,
to
wait. Did you just say
fabric.
you were fascinated by networking? Because I'm pretty sure the last time we
I
talked about it,
think
you said it put you to sleep.
no. I think I'm fascinated that the world woke up to it. That's why. It's
It is,
it's not it's yeah.
it is interesting. I mean, yeah. I mean, both Astera and Arista Inet put in impressive numbers, and their stocks are way up this week. And yeah, I mean, we've talked about it. Networking is important here, connecting all these things. I think I mean, Arista is the one that really caught my eye because I think a few quarters ago people were starting to write off Arista. Right? Let me go back a few years. When the last few years of cloud, even before AI, there was a
Yeah.
real disconnect between Cisco and Arista, right?
Right.
And there's some
Right.
comment. There's some. I mean, these companies have a shared history, and there's a big rivalry. And Cisco
Yep.
just became less and less relevant in the data center, and the data center really took off. And what was going on was the hyperscalers were trying to design a lot more of their networking elements, and Arista was had a much more flexible software centric architecture. Wasn't terribly complicated, but it was just better than what Cisco offered. They were much more software forward, and were much more able to deal with the hyperscalers who wanted something more tailored to them. And but then when AI hit, that thesis started to get weaker. Nvidia was doing very strong in data center, and and there was a concern that Arista would just get written out of the data center too.
Yep.
And that does not seem to be the case. There were fears last year that they were going to lose some of their big customers. They've, I think, assuaged those fears. Um, so it's good. It's good to see. It's good that I mean, I know for a fact I said this last year. Is like this is going to be one of the key competitive elements of AI is the networking side of things, right? Remember, Jensen says his big advantage in inference comes down to networking, right?
Right.
And let's also remember though that NVIDIA's data center networking revenue is bigger than Arista, and it's bigger than Cisco's data center. Right.
Yeah.
So we have to start thinking about this market very differently. Uh, yeah.
But I think there's two parts to this, right? And you're totally right. I think there was a view, and this is why networking to me like was not interesting, and maybe I'm getting more interested because of this. But it was a relatively in the general cloud stuff. It was relatively commodity. There was some customization happening to make switching and racks faster, but it was like commodity. And so Arista was a lower priced competitor. And so I think people just view like, well, you're just undercutting pricing, so this is one of the reasons. Like, can you really stick that out? But they both them and really Astera Labs similarly have been trying to change their narrative to we have the underlying goods in IP and product to be a center of this fabric, but that is necessitative to open standards, open Ethernet, right, being the core here. And it's not that NVIDIA doesn't have those, but I do think that if for some reason NVLink becomes a dominant factor in NVIDIA's clusters, and then NVIDIA is the dominant force that we talked about relative to AMD before, then you come back to again, well, then how much of that dollar share of the networking? It'll 100% those open Ethernet. This will be for custom ASICs as well. So TPUs use that. Microsoft will use that for their solutions. Amazon, etc. So fine. But I do think NVIDIA absorbs such a large portion of the dollars of the accelerator TAM that if NVLink is the standard for them, that just absorbs a portion of the market. Now again, Jensen's supporting open standards as well. In Ethernet, he's kind of like, right, if that's what you want, we'll get it, right? He's always said, I'll sell you whatever you want. I'm not going to force you into anything, but we make everything or in parts, or I'll sell you the whole thing, right? Whatever, up to you. But I do think the NVLink versus Ethernet is an interesting question about what dollar amount, right, that comes down to, and that's not settled yet. But most of these companies are in open Ethernet, open standards, which again they're well positioned for. Obviously, AMD will use that, and and the custom ASIC guys. So that's just kind of a nuance of the networking debate: proprietary versus open.
Yeah, I think this is what makes Broadcom NVIDIA's real rival, even more than AMD. Broadcom has this immensely capable suite of networking chips, and
Yeah.
you combine that with their custom ASIC work. They have a complete solution in a way that only NVIDIA has, right? And AMD is working up that, but they don't have networking. Uh, Broadcom has everything, and that makes them very formidable. And they've fought this fight before. Like they've battled other proprietary networking standards before. They have a long history of it. And I think this is one area where NVIDIA is long term vulnerable, because if you talk to the hyperscalers, they don't like paying NVIDIA prices, but they're okay with it. What really sort of, I think, sparks emotion in them and real passion to diverge is the extent to which GPU sales are tied to networking. And yeah, Jensen will sell you whatever you want, but really, he really wants you to buy the whole thing. And there's a lot of incentive and encouragement, let's say, built
Of
into
course, of
quoting
course.
mechanisms around NVIDIA product that strongly encourages customers to
Yes,
buy the networking side
yes,
too.
yeah.
And
Oh man, the lessons he learned, right, about how you bundle when he was out bundled in certain categories and GPUs. He saw it, tried to sue some companies. I'm not going to name names, but the Tegra debacle in mobile, and he learned this is how you bundle, baby. This is how you lock out
I'm
competitors.
I'm not going to use the word bundle because that is an FTC hot button term.
Nobody in the FTC listens to us, Jay.
I don't know if there's anyone left in the FTC to listen anyway. Um, but but yeah, and I think without Broadcom there, it would be very hard for everyone else to push through this. But Broadcom makes a lot of
Right.
money selling open Ethernet
Yeah.
switches, and they're you know
Yep.
they don't want that. They're going to fight back really hard to make sure that that stays that
Yep.
way.
Yeah, and let's not forget Marvell has some products here. I mean, they've got networking parts of the business. It's not all custom, despite the fact that I know everybody wants to talk about Marvell for custom.
They want to talk about them
You
for
know,
custom.
okay, okay, fair, fair. But I also think we shouldn't forget, right, that while the spotlight on them is for custom, and yes, the consensus is that's the largest growth of the business, they're in AI networking too. They've got assets for that. But I say all of that to say there's only a couple companies kind of really sitting in the center of this, of a pretty big dollar grab for AI networking. And it's a small list, right, that you've got to track. That's a key part of this. So I think that's interesting. But that's again why I say kind of people have woken up to, ooh, who are these couple companies? And they seem to be crushing earnings. So, maybe we should get a better handle on their business and come up with a larger, thesis for their growth, because they're going to see at least a couple quarters of the Nvidia moment of last year, where it was 100% growth year over year
Yeah,
quarters.
yeah,
AI.
yeah. I haven't read the transcript for the Astera call yet. They have a really interesting product, and I think they have aspirations to build a broader. Sorry, they have a very
They do.
narrow product set, but it's very important
Yes.
right now. They have
Correct.
aspirations to build that into a bigger platform. He described it to me as they're essentially Mellanox of this generation of chips of networking,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I don't know
Yep.
if they can
I
make that. There's a lot of technical things there, and they also have a fair degree of customer concentration, right? That's the thing, is you have 10 customers who can buy their products. They can swing numbers around. Hyperscalers give and the hyperscalers take away. So
yep.
Astera's a tricky one to follow, but they have this is their moment.
Yep. I think yeah, I think you're right, and that's the central question I've seen bounced around, which is how long does this run, or is this a short term, you know, buy while it runs and get out quickly because of the run ramp. But you're right. I have heard them sort of say, like, they wrote a really interesting blog actually earlier in the year about this thing that they're just calling, right, networking 2.0, which is really just saying AI networking is going to be a thing. Um, but the words that they have used is that, loosely we're transforming into an AI connectivity
Yeah,
platform company, and the product sets that get built out are within that vein. Now, I think they may actually be a super attractive acquisition target for a couple companies that might want to be aggressive
mhm.
here, and own parts of this stack. But shifting to this idea of a connectivity platform is interesting. But like I said, watch what happens with Cisco. Watch the commentary with Cisco. I think they're going to bring this up a ton as well about what's going on with Cisco Silicon One and what they're doing in AI networking, their partnerships with NVIDIA and a couple of the big neoclouds and hyperscalers. Cisco, I think, could have a bit of a resurgence here, which will be interesting.
Yeah. Cisco's another one on my list that I covered Cisco for years, a long time ago,
Yeah, I remember.
and
I remember. It was boring,
it
Jay.
really was. It got
Boring.
very boring. It was sort of moving in the direction of Oracle, where
Yeah,
it was just
absolutely.
about licensing software, and you had to have Cisco routers and some Cisco software in your network, and you had to pay a whole bunch for the software, and that was kind of the model they were moving to. And so it will be interesting to see if AI can transform them the way that AI is transforming Oracle.
Yeah.
I don't know.
This is the hope. This is the
Yeah.
hope. All right, good stuff to watch on AI networking. This will be a topic I am sure we will keep coming back to, because it's key in semis. All right, let's move to OpenAI. So OpenAI had two things happen this week that I think are super interesting to talk about. The first was they released for the first time their open source models, of varying sizes of parameters, 120 and 20 to or 15. I'm blanking, but something like that. One, I mean, obviously, both of these can run on device. Max on my team has been running the 120 on systems that he can run them on. Needs enough memory, obviously, just to test quality. Like, how good are these things, right? That run local. Can it do agentic work? And they're pretty good, right? And everybody came out of the woodworks to support the open platforms day one, right? So NVIDIA came out and said, hey, we believe in open source platforms. We know that open source platforms actually play a significant role in bringing cost of inference down, which that's true. And so, they're a huge proponent of bringing inference costs down. So their support open source runs great on NVIDIA GPUs, super fast. As a matter of fact, we've tested this on RTX 50 series. Qualcomm came out, said, hey, we're running these things locally on our devices, both mobile and on PCs. Microsoft came out on Windows. Windows supports all these running locally. They're in the Foundry, and even AMD, came out and talked about supporting this on their products as well. So the open source stuff is really, really interesting. Now, I will say my question for this, and I would lob this out again in, let's just call it the thesis for how much of this stuff's really going to run at the edge, is like, how often will OpenAI update these to keep them modern and cutting edge? Because my default, right, which we'll talk to about GPT-5, is, the cloud's just always going to be better. And for the foreseeable future, that's going to be a true statement. You will get more speed, more compute, better answers, better quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for most of your tasks. Now, I think there's a lot of tasks that make sense to run on device, but they're going to be limited to a handful of very simple things. But if those models don't keep getting updated, it's kind of like, well, then what's the point? Like, what am I going to do with these that I can't do, again, at a low cost inference cost with superior software in GPT? So that's kind of my broad, like, these things need to stay current. If they don't stay current, then they just become outdated models that run locally and are not as good as things that you want to run for your productivity or whatnot in the cloud. So that to me remains a question. I don't have a good answer for it. I just am curious because that's my point on open source. But everybody coming out of the woodworks to support this, integrate it, run it on device, I think is good. Again, you do need a lot of memory to run these, right? So they're not running amazingly on every device yet. And I imagine that we'll see future versions that are small. But that was OpenAI's first open-weighted, open-sourced model, for the world that people can use, build on, and run, more on-device AI. So it was good. Nothing world-shattering, but a good step for open source.
Yeah, yeah. It's always the question with open source, and that word gets bandied about a lot, and doesn't always mean the same thing to everybody. I think that there's this interesting debate. I don't know how much everyone else is paying attention to it, but there is this element in the AI race between China and the U.S. And there's a lot of people on the China side who are saying the Chinese labs are much better about making everything open,
right?
Releasing the
Right.
models, releasing the weights,
Right.
and that's seen as making that a better ecosystem for AI, and direct comparison to the U.S. labs, which are much more closed and much more proprietary.
Right.
And it's not clear to me at this point how much of that is sort of government encouraged. I don't think it's not, I don't know. Um,
Mm,
because there could be an element of that. There's
that's
definitely
a good point.
a sense that China is immensely capable in AI, but that the U.S. is still better, is more capable, I should say. And the idea being that, all right, all the Chinese companies have to sort of band together in order to compete with the U.S. So there is some element of concerted effort there, and I don't know how much OpenAI cares about that. I'm not sure it's an accurate analysis of it, but it is, that dynamic is out there, and I think, yeah, I think the fact of the matter is the U.S. labs are going to remain fairly closed and proprietary, and it's telling, right? They announced their open source model, what, 2 days before they announced their next big model,
Yeah.
right? And so glass half empty, their open source model is a generation behind. Glass half full, if they keep up that cadence, that's fine, right? If they can keep that up, that's still perfectly
Yeah.
adequate.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, right? We've been trying to figure out, and again, we've been testing the open source models against like prior models from GPT. So like, is it equivalent to, GPT 4.0 mini, or how close can you get to O3 Pro, which was the best model before GPT-5? Because I do think it's a question. Like, you said the point, right? Is it a generation behind? Maybe it might be a generation and a half. I'm not sure yet, but I think that's important because then the question would be, are we 2 years away from something like the quality of GPT-5 being able to run in something that's smaller than 150 billion parameters, and then obviously ideally can get into 20 or 15, which would be a sweet spot for on device, because that would happen, but how long will it happen? And that cadence I think is interesting. But again, to your point, right? It's not going to be bleeding edge, but I do want to see the degree that OpenAI kind of keeps this up. But like I said, huge step forward for open source and on device. I think it's gotten better. I don't think we're again at the point where I'm like, we don't need cloud models anymore, and we may never say that, or it'll be a long time. But regardless, it's a good step forward. It's far better than what we had before. Let's put it to you that way. So let's hope devs and I don't know, Apple maybe run some use this to, I don't know. Let's hope it's well used and integrated cleanly at system level stuff, because that's basically where it's going to run if it's going to run on device.
Yeah, that gives me an idea. We should put some math, or just we should compare roadmaps, because models are getting smaller and more capable. Or yeah, models are getting smaller, to your point, but at the same time, the chips in the edge devices in our phones and our PCs are still getting better at that. And so I wonder, at like 2 nanometer or 1 nanometer, 1.4 nanometer, we can start to like it becomes we get to some form of crossover where you can actually run pretty large models on device, right? My point being that like I
It's not compute though, it's memory.
eh,
Like if you tell me that in a year 32 gigs will be the minimum in a notebook and 16, I guess, in a phone, okay, then we can have a conversation of like, because it's really it's the context that matters here. And I know people are trying to have innovations in these models to improve context, to either distribute memory or hold it in memory differently. But that doesn't change the fact that we need differences. We need memory to become a key part of this. And that's where like we've tried testing some of these models on lower memory systems where it gets quantized to a lower level and they just start hallucinating like crazy. And you're like, you can't, like, that can't happen because I'm resource constrained at the edge.
yeah, but Chongqing Memory is launching DDR5 later this year, and they should have HBM next year. So memory prices are going to come
Yeah.
down. So maybe that's
Right. That's what I'm saying. If you tell me we'll have a minimum bar across all devices, then I can say yes. Like model wise, here's the timing. Because I actually don't necessarily think it's a function of compute. I think CPUs, right, next year will be able to handle 100 parameter models pretty easily. It's the memory that this is the variable on those machines. So that's a different
yeah,
timeline. But you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
that
yeah.
that to me is the constraint.
So yeah, I mean, but that's it. We compare the timelines, and I'll bet you that point is like 3 years out, depending how pricing and memory goes. Right?
Yeah, agree. All right, so to GPT-5, again, this was interesting to me. And I'm using all of this to get to a central point that I think is interesting. Um, Again, to your point, right? They just kind of press released open source model GPT, and the world came out and had some announcements. They had a whole live stream for GPT-5, and there are three models. There's GPT-5 Basic, GPT-5 Thinking, and then GPT-5 Pro. Now, what's happened with these models, because we've been using them and testing them, is essentially you don't actually need to pick your model. Like you can just go to base level GPT-5, and I feel like this is a huge step forward because I've been saying like I hate having to be like, all right, what do I want to do? Now which model do I need to choose? And that the point of that is that in the prior solutions, and this is true of any system that I'm going to say that you need to go through this exercise of you got to basically test every model and then figure out where its limitations are so that you can decide what you can use each one for. So now OpenAI has solved that. So you just give it the query and then it decides, does it need to be thinking or does it need to go to pro for long reasoning? And so it solves some of that for you. Now, even if it doesn't pick the right things, so say for example that you've given it a task to analyze a spreadsheet or come up with a budget or do something, and it does it too fast, then you can tell it, look, think a little bit more. Now, in my opinion, that's not great UI. Like you still got to perceptively, come up with, make it think more. I still got to manage it, and I don't want to have to do that. But the reality is, you can manage it in a way as you need in a back and forth to get the most out of it by telling it to think more, doing yada yada yada. The other thing it does that I like a ton is it starts to kind of work with you more than any other model. So it'll maybe ask a follow-up question, or before it goes and executes a really long thinking task. Like it'll know, like I did this. I was trying to create some of our data, our big data sets, into an interactive React component in a charts, right? So interactive charts. And it knew that was going to take some time. So it was like, all right, before I go and do that, let's just double check, like, this is what you want. You want your brand colors. You want these variables inside for your forecasts. And so I was like, that's tremendous, because prior it would go run this thing and I'd be like, you screwed it up. You didn't do it right. And that's partially my fault for not being an incredible A-list prompter. But the reality is, like, there's so much back and forth. So they're trying to get you to what I think is an ultimate goal here, the best quality output for you in a one-shot output of a reasoning model. So even if it asks you some follow-up questions, I wouldn't call that the one shot. It's like, get to the point to where I'm going to go execute a complex task, and it's going to be what you want when I'm done with it. And that precursor of that conversation and collaboration is actually great. Because like I said, it feels like, to use this term, right, when you and I, like, collaborate and say, hey, let's build a forecast. We're going through assumptions, we're making conversations, and then somebody's going to go off and do it. And largely, like, we have worked out all those variables in advance, so we're pretty sure what we're going to get. It's kind of more like that now, right, as a collaborator. And I think that's great. It's the best at doing that than anything we've used, is kind of feeling like a collaborator, even to the point where it says things like, our model, our forecast, like, we are doing this. And I'm like, that's cool, because we're doing this together. But anyway, I like that. And again, I have seen it produce better output right off the shot, right? When I've told it to go do something, less errors, works really well, exactly what I want because of this process. So I love that. Max on my team is writing software. Code is coming better with less errors. So I do feel like it's a leap forward. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the world-changing leap forward that got hyped up by, OpenAI and Sam Altman, but it is a good leap forward, a good step forward in the model, and I think everybody that uses it will feel its quality has gotten better.
I think it is incremental. And so, to a degree, I was a little bit disappointed yesterday, watching the live stream, because it was all stuff that we could have done before. It just does that stuff better. So it's not really. I wouldn't call it a leap. It's just a step forward. It's incremental improvement. And I don't dispute it's better. Like, I was playing around with it last night. It's better, but it's also, they promised me jetpacks and flying cars, and I got.
They promised you artificial general intelligence.
I get computer pronouns.
So here's the point, though, that I'm getting to. All of this, to me, both the open source models and then the dozens of companies that came out to support this, to the GPT-5 launch yesterday, and then again the dozens of companies from, it runs on NVIDIA, it runs on these backend clouds, it's going to run in your software, Box, Aaron Levy at Box is like, this is going to be the default model. It's running in Windows and Copilot now. You see this like ecosystem surround OpenAI when something comes out to say, we're here, day one, we've worked with them, we're integrating these models. And here's my point. You don't see that happen with Google and Gemini. And I think Gemini is a fantastic model. I think Google has closed the gap on model. But when they come out with a new model, everybody under the sun is not like, we're integrating Gemini. And my point is that just tells you OpenAI is the perceived leader. They're the one that everyone wants to default into their solution. And I do think that has to weigh into, right, our optimism that anybody as third parties, not Google will use Gemini all they want, et cetera, but that there isn't that third party ecosystem. And so it's the same way that we have talked about in compute infrastructure, NVIDIA being the sun, everybody wants to attach themselves to NVIDIA. In the software and AI ecosystem, OpenAI is also a sun, and everybody wants to attach themselves to OpenAI. So that was my lead into my little insight point. So there you go.
I don't dispute that OpenAI is the clear leader right now. But I do think we haven't fully scoped out what the future of AI is. We're still so early in it that I think that there are like whole business models have yet to be discovered around AI.
Right.
And it's so wide open that I don't know that today's leaders can hold on to that. Right? But if it just stays like this, yeah, OpenAI is looking very strong. Everyone is dependent on them. Not everybody, but yeah, they're
Right.
they're putting themselves in a place where a lot of people are going to be dependent on them.
Well, and importantly, like they actually these were really aggressive token prices, right? Per 1,000 tokens, both in and out, like really aggressive. And I think that's again why, because so just look at this, right? I use a bunch of online software as a service stuff that's creating wrappers right around their databases and their software and adding agents, and that's all OpenAI. So that company, right, is making a lot of money off me because I'm paying as a part of that as a subscription. And their costs have just gone down, right, by integrating these new models, and it got better. And so I really do think this is important in just this idea of, tracking token and inference costs over time, right, per 1,000 tokens. And then how is that helping business economics integrate this more? And so, I don't actually know what Gemini's cost per 1,000 tokens are, but I make this point to say there's also a cost part of this to factor into what model you use and who you integrate and why. And as long as they're in the vein of competitive model, which they are, and their pricing is competitive, right? The perception of that lead or whatever it is, like it just remains strong. And again, I would just go back to this, right? It's not. I think Gemini is a great model. I think Google will continue to close any gaps and have a leading edge model. But nobody's going to get fired for building their software wrapper around OpenAI, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it.
We'll see. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's their position is quite as secure as that. At least not long term. Right now, yeah, but 2 years from now, it could be very different.
All right, good. We put a pin in it. We'll still be podcasting in 2 years, so we can revisit that track. Good. All right. Lastly, you wanted to make a point about what we're not going to say. Something we're not going to say.
Apparently, there was some news about a company called Intel this week, and we decided to deliberately not talk about it, just because. I mean, this is not the first time this has happened with this company. There's stuff in the press, and that's it. We don't know what's going on, so we acknowledge that it's happening, but we also spare you. We know there are Intel people who don't want to hear about Intel, so
right.
You're welcome. We're not talking about it.
We thought it was important to acknowledge it. We're not. It's not that we didn't see it. We're just not going to talk about it. So there you go, everybody. The non-subject ending of the day. Okay. All right. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Appreciate your time. We will be back with you next week, and we'll talk to you.
Thank you, everybody. Click like, subscribe, tell your friends.